All right, so you know how sometimes you go to like a big game or a concert and everybody sees the same thing, but then when you're talking about it later, everybody remembers it kind of different?
Oh, yeah, totally. Like, different details stand out to people.
Right. That's kind of what's going on with the Norman Conquest. It's 1066, big deal, but how we understand it comes down to who's telling the story. And luckily, we've got this like pile of sources for this deep dive.
Hmm.
The Bayeux Tapestry, it's seriously like a medieval comic strip. We got the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle,
Always a good one.
then the Norman Chronicles, of course, and to keep things interesting, even some archaeological stuff.
Yeah, it's not like just one battle, right? It's like the whole how the winners and the losers each, shaped how we think about it. It'd be like if we only ever heard about that football game from like the winning team's
We'd
interviews.
only get one side.
Exactly. A biased view.
Okay, so before we get into all that juicy drama, gotta set the stage. So who exactly were these Normans anyway?
Well, basically, we're talking Viking descendants. But they'd settled in France, Normandy, we call it now. So they'd picked up, like, the French language, some of the customs.
But they still had that, like, inner Viking warrior thing going on.
Oh, absolutely. Don't mess with the Normans. And on the other side of the English Channel, you got the Anglo-Saxons. Been in England for ages, centuries, right?
Yes,
Their own kings, laws, whole culture.
Not just gonna roll over for some Norman invasion.
Nope, not at all.
Okay, so it's 1066, and William, the Duke of Normandy, gets this idea he's the rightful heir to the English throne. But King Harold, the English king, is like, nah, not so fast.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah, things get messy quick, and boom, the Battle of Hastings.
Imagine this. The Anglo-Saxons, their classic move is the shield wall, super tight formation, all those warriors, shields overlapping, strong stuff.
Tough to crack, right?
Right. But suddenly, here come the Normans, on horseback, like a wave of heavily armored knights. Terrifying, brand new tactic.
And on top of that,
Oh, there's more.
it's not just the knights.
No.
They brought the archers, too.
Barrage of arrows, raining down. Anglo-Saxons not ready for that at all.
Brutal. Clash of styles. And we all know who wins. Spoiler alert, it's the Normans.
History, right?
King Harold gets killed. Williams the Conqueror takes the crown. Christmas Day, no less.
Coronation on Christmas. Talk about a power move.
So yeah, that's a huge shift, right? Like a seismic event. I mean, William brings all this Norman stuff, laws, customs, the language, even like he reshapes English society big time.
Oh, yeah, massive changes. And to make sure everyone gets the message, what does he start building all over England?
Castles. Can't miss those, that's for sure.
Hard to ignore a giant stone castle. Statement made.
Okay, so we've got the conquest, the aftermath, but how do all our sources spin it? Let's start with the Bayeux Tapestry, like that 70-meter-long embroidery project.
Amazing piece of art, truly.
You can see everything, the ships, the fighting, even little details like what they ate. It's wild.
But we got to remember who probably paid for this tapestry. A Norman bishop. So yeah, visual record, awesome, but it's definitely leaning towards the Norman point of view.
Makes sense.
Bravery, heroism, all that. Might skip over some of the less, shall we say, noble moments.
Like a medieval propaganda campaign.
Pretty much, yeah. For example, how Harold dies. The tapestry makes it seem like he was being all sneaky, justifying William taking over. But then we got the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Monks wrote this one. English monks.
I bet they have some thoughts.
Oh, yeah. It's loss, anger, the pain of conquest, the English people suffering, William's the ruthless invader.
Can't blame him for feeling that way. King's dead, land's gone, whole way of life turned upside down.
Exactly. Bitterness is understandable.
Okay, so we got Team Norman, Team Anglo-Saxon. But what about those Norman Chronicles you mentioned?
Well, those are straight-up history, written by the Normans, obviously. So William, totally the good guy. Righteous conqueror, meant to be king.
Shocker.
Right, he's pious, he's a military genius. Norman rule's the best thing ever, blah, blah, blah.
Victors write the history books. Classic.
It happens. But we've also got actual stuff from back then, right? Not just words. We've got the castles, weapons, everyday objects. Archaeology gives us a whole different angle.
That's got to be more objective, right? Like a sword's a sword, no matter who's spinning the tale.
Exactly. Physical objects cut through the narrative, so to speak. Like compare Norman weapons to Anglo-Saxon ones. Tells us about how they fought, what technology they had.
So it's like a silent witness to what really went down. Maybe confirms what we read, maybe contradicts it.
Fascinating stuff. And that's why the Norman Conquest is so interesting to study. Dates and battles, sure, but it's also about whose point of view you're getting, how they saw it.
Like we're history detectives or something.
Exactly. We've got all these clues, got to piece them together.
Huh.
But before we go full Sherlock Holmes on those sources, let's take a quick break. We'll be back to dig into all the motivations and biases behind these historical stories. So, we've talked about the big stuff, right? The Battle of Hastings, that amazing Bayeux Tapestry, the Chronicles. But what about, like, the regular people? What happened to them when the Normans took over?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about too. Like, it's easy to get caught up in all the kings and conquerors and stuff, but real people's lives were changing.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where comparing those chronicles, the Anglo-Saxon one and the Norman ones, it gets really interesting, even kind of sad sometimes. Like the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, they don't hold back on how tough it was for the English people under Norman rule.
So not just a new king, it's like everything's different. Societal upheaval, huh?
Exactly. The chronicle talks about forced labor, taxes going way up, people losing their land or their homes. Imagine you're a farmer, been on your land for generations. Suddenly, you're working for some Norman lord, speaking a language you don't even understand, laws you had no say
It
in.
must have been scary. Like your whole world's flipped upside down.
Completely disorienting and, yeah, terrifying for a lot of people.
It's like a reminder that history isn't just dates and names in a book. It's what actually happened to people.
You got it. And the Norman Chronicles, they might not focus on the bad stuff so much, but they do give us these glimpses into how the Normans tried to, I guess, make their rule work in England. They talk about setting up new legal systems, building those castles, those huge cathedrals, and how the languages started to mix Norman French and Old English.
So even from the sources that are kind of biased, we can still learn something about how society changed overall. Like two sides of the same coin, maybe? Each one tells part of the story.
That's a great way to put it. We look at both sides, and we get closer to understanding what life was really like for both the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons. Like, take the feudal system. Huge deal, right? This hierarchy where you get land, but you owe loyalty and military service. That shaped England for centuries. Who owned land? Who could move up in society? All of it.
So we're not just talking about right after the battle. We're seeing these long-term consequences. It's like one thing happens, and then it just keeps rippling out, changing things.
Exactly. And it wasn't always peaceful either. People rebelled. There was resistance, tensions between the Normans and the Anglo-Saxons that didn't just go away. But over time, you get this new culture forming, a mix of both Norman and Anglo-Saxon stuff.
So learning about the Norman Conquest, it's not just medieval history. It's also like the origins of how England is today, the culture, the language, even politics, maybe.
Yeah, you're right. It's all connected, the past and the present. And it goes back to those different perspectives we talked about. When we know that history can be told from different angles, and that everyone's got their own biases and reasons for telling it their way, it makes us think more critically about all information, not just historical stuff.
It's like a superpower or something. Seeing through the spin, questioning what we're told.
It's a super valuable skill, especially these days when there's so much information coming at us all the time. The Norman Conquest, it reminds us to always be asking, who's telling the story? Why are they telling it? And what's missing from their version?
Those castles William built, though, those must have been a huge symbol for everyone. Normans, Anglo-Saxons, I mean, you can't miss them.
Absolutely. Castles are amazing. They're like this physical connection to the past. The Norman Chronicles, they'd focus on how important they were for strategy, how grand they were, symbols of Norman power.
And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they'd probably see those castles and think, yep, we're conquered. Symbols of oppression.
Yeah.
Exactly. But the castles themselves, they tell their own story too, how they're built, where they're placed, how they were defended. Archaeologists, they can dig down, find out about life inside those walls, what technology they used to build them. It's like the stones themselves are talking to us.
Wow, that's cool. So we've got all these pieces, the writing, the physical stuff, and then we got to use our own brains to figure it all out.
That's the fun part. History's not just about memorizing facts. It's a conversation with the past, asking questions, figuring things out, and realizing that what we know about history can change as we learn more.
I'm starting to get why this event, even though it happened like 1,000 years ago, still matters today. But let's be real. Some people listening might be thinking, why should I care about something that old?
That's fair. But I think the Norman Conquest, it shows us things about people that are always true. How people get power, how they keep it, how societies change, how different cultures clash sometimes. It's like conflict and conquest. They happen over and over throughout history. So if we understand those patterns, maybe it helps us understand the world we live in today.
Like seeing ourselves reflected in a historical mirror. Things are different, but the stuff underneath, the power, the ambition, it's all still there.
Yeah, and it shows us how important perspective is. Knowing that there's always more than one side to every story, that's crucial. especially these days when it feels like everyone's got their own facts.
So, the Norman Conquest, it's not just a story from the past. It's a way to understand how people work, how power works. It's about winners and losers, cultures changing, and how one thing can have consequences for centuries.
And it's a story that keeps going, We find new evidence, we ask new questions, and what we thought we knew can change. History's not just sitting there, it's alive, it's changing all the time.
Okay, so we've gone from medieval England to today. That's pretty cool. But before we wrap this up, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. What if we only had the stories told by the winners? How much would we be missing?
That's a great question. It reminds us that history can be biased, that the people in power, their version of the story, isn't always the whole truth. It's up to us to find those other perspectives, the people who were ignored, whose voices are missing, what didn't get told. Those are the questions we got to keep asking.
To our listeners, go be history detectives. Find those hidden stories, make sure those forgotten voices get heard, and never just accept what you're told. The past is full of surprises. Go find them.
So we've really dug deep into this Norman Conquest thing, huh? We've seen the battles, the tapestry, read those old chronicles, even heard from the castles themselves. It's amazing how many ways there are to look at just one event.
It really shows you history isn't just about the facts, right? It's about how we make sense of them, how we put the story together.
Yeah, like a jigsaw puzzle, but sometimes the pieces don't quite fit. Exactly. Conflicting accounts, biases, stuff we just don't know. It makes it tricky to get the full picture.
So for someone who wants to really understand history, what are the big things to keep in mind?
Well, I'd say the most important thing is to not just believe everything you read or hear. Be skeptical.
Don't just take it at face value.
Right. Always ask yourself, who wrote this? Why did they write it? Are they trying to push a certain viewpoint? And who's missing from the story?
Like a detective. Right, you got to look at all the clues.
Exactly. And remember, history's not over. New stuff comes up all the time, new ways of looking at things. What we think we know about the Norman Conquest now, well, maybe new discoveries will change that.
So it's not just about memorizing dates and names.
Nope. It's about being open to new ideas and willing to change your mind when you learn something new.
That's what makes it so interesting. It's always changing, always making us think. Makes you wonder what other events we could re-examine, What other hidden stories are out there just waiting to be discovered.
That's the beauty of history. It's a journey that never really ends. So many stories to tell, so many perspectives, and they all connect to us today. So keep asking those questions, keep looking for the missing pieces, and never stop learning.
And that's a wrap for our deep dive into the Norman Conquest. Thanks for joining us, and keep exploring.